So let's start with some bit of intro about us and who we are, why we are doing what we are doing, and just introduce to TCAE or Toronto Compliance and AML Group. So my name is Susanna Smiley. I'm your host and moderator for today. I'm the founder of the TCAE as well. I founded this wonderful group of a lot of enthusiast people around a year ago. And basically the aim for the TCAE initially was just to start being a centralized location for all the events that are happening in Toronto in terms of financial crime, compliance, and basically that idea has been expanded since the beginning of the pandemic, and we started something called knowledge series session, which now you're part of right now, where we are bringing in a knowledge, we're bringing a lot of talent and experts, from all over the world. And basically they are subject matter experts and industry gurus, which we are very privileged, to have them in our sessions. They are each session we have been covering different topics, from financial crime, regulatory compliance, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and AI so far. And we're gonna do more sessions on each and every section of it. And this is our 27th session so far. We had been having this since March. And we had a lot of people coming in from all over the world. And as you could see on the chat box, I think you have realized that, how diverse, the audience are. And we are really pleased, to have that um, to have that group that we can address from different parts. We have a lot of great experience in the house, and different levels of experience as well. And we're really privileged, to have you joining us on your Saturday. We know that, for many of you, it's early morning. For many of you, it's early in the night, but you're managing, to come and joining us and, making this wonderful session valuable. So we are hoping that, you're enjoying this session. So for today, we have a very special guest speaker from all over from the UK. Ray Blake is with us today from the Dark Money Files. The reason why we chose this topic, and you basically might know him on LinkedIn, or you might know the Dark Money Files on LinkedIn. It was that the beginning of the FinCEN Files and the investigation of that, the team of Ray's team have been involved with the interviews of the ICIJ, and they have been quite involved with the investigation and reporting, and with the journalists. So he's gonna tell us a lot more about what was happening behind, and give us a lot of perspective of what were things that we just saw the report. What are the things that we haven't seen? What are the things that we need to look more deeply into this file? So I think that after now 2 months past the news that the leak released, I think that's gonna be a very good segue for us to look into and see that what happened there, what happened when the file was released, what were the outcome of that. And that's why we thought that this session is going to be much relevant for you, to get that input and experience from the very best people who have worked closely with this report. And with that, I want to pass over to the guest speaker of this week, Ray. Thank you so much for being with us. It's really a pleasure, to have you. I'm sure that we are going to learn a lot from you in this session. And I'll pass over the floor. Please let us know about you, about your background, and
Sure.
about the story about this amazing leak.
Sure. Thank you, Suzanne. I will absolutely do that, I promise. But first of all, I just wanted to reflect on how I'm a really big fan of the knowledge series and of what you're doing for the community. And it's an absolute privilege to be part of that program. Um, I'm Ray Blake. I am a writer and presenter with my business partner, Graham Barrow. We collaborate together on a podcast called The Dark Money Files. It's an anti financial crime podcast that's now approaching its second anniversary. I know anniversaries are quite relevant around here, and congratulations on your first anniversary upcoming.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah. So yeah, no, big fan. So, well, what can I tell you? Well, the FinCEN files have proved a bit controversial in our community, but outside of it, there's been a bit of a media frenzy. What the media at large, though, is interested in is often different from what interests the geeks. Um, and in this, we count very much as the geeks. I feel like I'm here with my people today, which is nice. Um, Let me begin with a quick recap on the facts that are widely known, and then I'll take you behind the curtain for a look at some of the less well explored aspects of the leaks that I think are really worth thinking about at length. But before we go there, why should you listen to me about this? Well, 15 months before the story broke internationally in September of this year, the Dark Money Files was approached by BuzzFeed News, who received the initial leak. Um, and we helped them and the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, make sense of the material they had. Um, we saw leaked SARS, suspicious activity reports, that you won't have heard about in the papers for various reasons. Um, in some cases, that was because we cautioned them that disclosure could compromise ongoing investigations without an overwhelming public interest justification. Um, we explained what they sometimes thought was bank negligence or collusion, actually, or at least probably wasn't. And generally, we helped them gain some context and perspective that meant their reporting would be more fair and balanced than it otherwise might have been. But I have to say, we didn't foist that fairness and balance on them. It's what they wanted in the first place, which is why they came to us. So, a very swift primer on the FinCEN files. I've collected the basic facts from a great BBC article that you can find online if it's of interest. The heading of the article is visible on your screen now. Here's an example of the kind of material that BuzzFeed and the ICIJ received. A couple of thousand suspicious activity reports, partially redacted, like this one in places, and a smaller number of additional supporting documents. Now, these had all been submitted by reporting entities, by banks, to FinCEN in its role as the financial intelligence unit for the United States. Many of these made little sense in isolation and told only part of a story. But sometimes it was possible to put lots of them together and build some significant insight into situations that, to this point, had gone entirely under the radar. Here is the BBC's summary of some of those major stories. And you're going to notice a fairly censorious tone here in places. Global organizations are name checked throughout the FinCEN files, and there's nothing like brand name recognition to sell a financial crime story. So this much is well known. But let's now take a slightly less trodden path, and look more deeply at some of the unreported or underreported facets of these files. So here are what we consider the key takeaways of the FinCEN files for the AFC geek community. Welcome, brothers and sisters. I want to talk a little bit about sampling and selectivity, and show why it might not be appropriate to take comfort that your own institutions may not have featured too greatly in these disclosures. We'll go on to look at the scale of SAR reporting and the implications for banks and FIUs facing resource constraints. Then we'll go beyond the popular reporting and highlight a few facts you might not have read about. And then once we've done that, we're going to do the really lazy thing that everybody else does, and we're going to close with that old cliche, the what can we learn piece, as a preface to then taking questions. By all means, as questions occur to you, pop them in the chat, and I think Suzanne will then have the job of forwarding them to me at the end, and I will work through as many as we have time for. So, sampling then. What we call the FinCEN files is a set of 2,657 documents, most of those SARs that were accumulated over a 17-year period that began in the year 2000. The ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and BuzzFeed have been very circumspect in skirting around the circumstances of exactly how these files came to be leaked and who was responsible. Recently, two names have been speculatively linked with the actual leak, but I'm afraid that's an aspect of the files I'm not able to talk about for hopefully understandable reasons. However, what I can tell you is that this was not a random sample of documents. This was actually a selection of SARs that was put together in response to a request from the Mueller inquiry into Russian interference in the 2016 United States election. Now, this may come as news to you, but that's where the FinCEN files actually come from. What we have here is necessarily, therefore, quite a skewed sample of SARs coming into FinCEN. And it's skewed in favour of Russian names and interests, which predominate throughout. It's skewed to feature political motivations rather than necessarily purely criminal ones. And I guess it's no surprise that among the institutions featured to a large extent, Deutsche Bank is prominent, given their role as the president's personal bankers and lenders and their extensive interests in Russia and their track record of facilitating illicit flows from Russia. It's not a surprise that they predominate here. And when you look at the volumes involved, it's clear that this is a tiny, tiny skewed sample of the overall US SARS portfolio. And unless you know this, then the conclusions that you're going to draw from the FinCEN files disclosures and the stories are going to be questionable ones. So we need to be very careful about the conclusions that we make from such a biased sample effectively. Let's look briefly at volumes again, and I'm going to look at a jurisdiction that I'm very familiar with, which is the UK. Our FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, is the National Crime Agency, the NCA. And just to highlight the situation that a typical FIU is in here, think about this. 400 of the ICIJ's investigators took a year to fully investigate the 2,121 SARs that make up the FinCEN files. 400 of them collaborating around the world. While that was going on, the NCA in London received 478,437 SARs in a typical year. I'll say that again, nearly 500,000 SARs. So, as we saw with the ICIJ, to investigate in any depth takes a lot of people. 2,000 SARs took 400 investigators a year. How many have the NCA got? Well, the NCA has a staff of 118. That includes interns. For all I know, it includes cleaners and receptionists as well. And this is a key point because we all work for, I'm assuming, commercial organisations that can't offer a lack of resources as an excuse for not meeting our anti-financial crime obligations to our regulators. Public authorities, though, do face very real resourcing challenges and constraints. So, in this environment, the SAR reporting regime has to be about intelligence and not investigation. It is not reasonable to expect that every suspicion that we report to our FIU will immediately initiate a direct investigation in a law enforcement environment. It's just unreasonable to expect it. It can't happen. But what can happen is that they are carefully indexed and logged and can be extracted as a sample subsequently. And if you think about it, that's exactly what happened with this selection, which is the FinCEN files, when Mr. Mueller said, hey, FinCEN, can you give me some background intelligence that might give me an idea of the scale of Russian interference in the US elections? They were able to say, yeah, we'll cross-index and we will sort you out a pile of that intelligence. And that is the greater value of SAR data. Okay, now, as I've already suggested, the reporting instincts of the media mean that aspects of the leaks of most interest to us, the the AFC geeks, haven't been too widely reported. So I think we should geek out for a little while and look at some of those aspects. So I've listed here some of the perspectives that interested me in particular. So the first one that I think is worth noting is that the majority of the activities reported to FinCEN happened outside FinCEN's jurisdiction. Why? Well, because pretty much every one of these 2,100 and odd SARs was made by the US correspondent bank, not by the bank that initiated or received the transactions being reported. So you have banks in Europe or Asia or the Middle East or Mexico or Canada, wherever, who are passing transactions, typically in US dollars, through a US correspondent account. And the only SARs that we're seeing in the FinCEN files are the SARs that are issued by those correspondent banks who are SARing once they've looked in their correspondent files. Did their respondent banks file their own local SARs as well? Well, we've got no way of knowing. These files can't tell us that, and the banks aren't allowed to tell us that. So much of the incredulity in the reporting has focused on the bank's unwillingness to close accounts, to stop dealing with these nefarious, shady clients. But of course, as a correspondent bank, that's not a power you have. They're not your clients. They're the clients of your client banks, which makes everything so much harder to do. So that's worth thinking about. Another aspect that you might want to reflect on here is that when you look at these SARs in detail, one of the things that unifies them is a consistent theme of poor UBO knowledge. And I have to say that it's hard to defend the banks here. Not so much the reporting banks, the US correspondents who've actually filed these SARs, but they're respondent banks, which very often, of course, are actually the overseas subsidiaries of those same banks, but need not necessarily be. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in these files we see the banks going to their respondents and asking for UBO information and being told that the responding banks don't actually know who owns an entity that they're banking. Bearing in mind that is a prime commitment under pretty much every anti-money laundering regime in the civilized world, that's quite difficult to defend the banks on that. So, next point, banks may, in some cases, have been instructed to proceed with a suspicious transaction or to maintain a suspicious relationship, and that's absolutely not uncommon. And the bank's defenders, as far as these stories are concerned, and I'd number myself amongst the bank's defenders in most cases, have to an extent stressed this line, which is, well, the banks can't or may not have been allowed to ditch these clients, to close these accounts, irrespective of the fact that as correspondent banks they're in no position to. They may, it's claimed, have been instructed by the FIU, by law enforcement, to maintain those accounts or relationships. Well, yeah, that's certainly true. But what you perhaps need to consider is that none of these SARs were made until after the transactions had been completed. None of these were what we might call consent or defense against money laundering SARs. They were all made after the fact, as you would expect with a correspondent banking SAR. So there's no question of any of these transactions going ahead at the direction of FinCEN, particularly when you consider this next point, which is that the median reporting time in the SARs that were leaked was 166 days from the time of activity to the time of filing. 166 days, and often it was years longer than that. Often the SARs were issued because news reports that the banks became aware of prompted them to file, rather than their own internal oversight. I'll just let that sink in for a moment. That's not great. And the final point is a point I think that we've already made, which is that the leak itself, for all the criticism about a lack of investigation that's been experienced, that when you know where the leak comes from and the circumstances in which these files were put together, the leak itself validates the use of SARs as an ongoing intelligence rather than an investigation source. That's what these files were all about. It was a pack of intelligence, remember, assembled for Robert Mueller's inquiry. Now, there is another side to all this as well. We learned alongside the FinCEN leaks of some leaks that threw more light on the goings on at Danske Bank's Estonia branch, which you may remember was found to have facilitated some 200 billion euros or so of illicit flows between 2007 and 2015. And if you didn't know that, you know that now. But if you're anything like me, large numbers like this tend to lose their meaning once you get past a million or two. The brain's ability to conceptualize lots of money is poor. So consider this. If you were to start counting now at the rate of one number per second, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just keep going and you don't stop for meals and you don't stop overnight, etc., etc., etc. You never sleep. You will reach a million in 11 and a half days. 11 and a half days from now, kind of right at the time you're probably putting Christmas decorations up, thinking about getting a tree in the house maybe, you're going to have counted to a million. You'll be quite tired, but you will have counted to a million. If you keep going rather than stopping at a million, if you keep counting, eventually you'll get to 1 billion. It will take you 31 and a half years to get to 1 billion. So when you think, man, once you get over a million or two, it's just a lot. Yeah, it's a lot, but think about the scale of this. It's absolutely enormous. So when we talk about the laundering of illicit flows worth 200 billion, just to count that many numbers, remembering that you'll get to a million in 11 and a half days, would take you more than 2 lifespans to get to. It would take you 200 years just to count that much. Okay. Worth thinking about. So, what did we pick up? What did we learn new? Some new insights into Danske. And if you are an AFC geek, this is quite big, actually. So, the FinCEN leak was accompanied by a further leak of Estonian police files. Yikes. These revealed that some of the bankers who worked at the time for Danske Estonia were setting up LLPs on behalf of customers through their own secret company that existed kind of outside of the bank. And if you don't know what an LLP is, an LLP is a limited liability partnership. That's a UK corporate entity which you can set up in the UK with minimal paperwork at a cost of £12, which is about 16 US dollars, a few more Canadian. And these are the money laundering tools of choice in every global laundromat that we so far know about. These companies that were set up by the staff at Danske Estonia are still live, and you can find them in the public register at Companies House. And if you look up the media reports on the people who have been arrested in association with Danske Estonia and do a search of Companies House like I did, you'll find that those companies are still there. They're still going concerns. They're still earning money. From what? I wouldn't like to speculate. But here is clear evidence of bank staff not just turning a blind eye, not just colluding, but actively facilitating money laundering, making available the tools by which criminals can launder money through their organizations. What else did we find in these leaks? Well, we found known links to mirror trading companies that were confirmed. Now, mirror trading deserves its own presentation entirely, which we can't really go into today. But we knew about mirror trading activities by Russian interests undertaken at Deutsche Bank and at ING. We knew which companies they traded through. And now we know those same companies were also used to launder funds through Danske. And this is entirely separate to the 200 billion as well. And when you consider that the peak of activity in 2013, the amount of money that was being laundered through that one small branch of a foreign bank in Estonia was equal to 90% of the GDP of Estonia, you can see that this is money laundering on a frankly industrial scale. So what else did we learn? Well, we also have a new link to the Kanani money laundering network working through Danske Bank Estonia, as well as the Brothers Circle, a drug trafficking gang. And this is big because it's evidence that Danske in Estonia wasn't just a purpose-built vehicle for capital flight from Russia through a group of Russian oligarchs. This is a network that provides money laundering as a service to different criminal groups. Now, it hasn't been operating in Danske's Estonia branch now since 2015, when the non-resident portfolio was shut down. I seriously doubt that it's gone away entirely, and I think we'll find it fairly soon. There's one tantalizing link in the leaks that we got from the Estonian police, because there are some fairly clear links to Danske Bank's Lithuanian branch as well. So there may be more disclosures to come from that. We'll have to watch out for that. Okay, so let's move into the lazy close to the session. What must we learn from this? A few things. Firstly, don't take false alarm, but also don't take false comfort from a skewed sample of leaked files. If you looked at those stories and you said, well, that's bad news for HSBC, those Deutsche Bank guys and JP Morgan, wow, glad they didn't home in on us. That's false comfort. The reason those organizations were so prominent was because of the sampling methodology for those files. You cannot conclude that because your bank was not prominent in there, that your bank does not feature in the wider group of files that are available to FinCEN. Secondly, late reporting is better than no reporting, but speed is important. Put yourself in the situation here of FinCEN or of any FIU. If you don't know about a suspicious transaction until on average 160 odd days after that transaction has been completed, what are you going to do? Assuming that you're in any position to act immediately, what can you possibly do that long after the event? So speed is important. What else can we learn? Oh, hit the wrong button there. What else can we learn? Well, think about who in a global bank is reporting what to which FIU. Because in none of those SARs that were sent to FinCEN was FinCEN jurisdictionally competent to do anything at all other than collect it as intelligence and say, oh, that's interesting. Whereas in many cases, the respondent banks that were responsible for those transactions were the overseas subsidiaries of those same US correspondent banks. So my suggestion is, and yes, there are cross-jurisdictional data sharing issues and all of that, and we understand all of that, but my suggestion is that we have a globally aware reporting system in the global banks so that you actually do the primary reporting where it can actually make a difference, where there is some jurisdictional oversight. Next, defensive filing when you haven't met your regulatory KYC obligations represents a poor defense. Now, much of the filing that goes on, and this has been widely criticized internationally, is defensive filing. It is the banks saying, you know what, we're gonna put this transaction through anyway, or we already have put this transaction through anyway, but just in case, to cover ourselves, we're gonna whack this off to the FIU so that if it subsequently comes out, we've kind of covered ourselves, we've reported it. Which is fine, but if when you report it, you're not able to give basic information like, well, who have we actually done this for? don't know, you're not exactly covering yourself in glory there. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that that's common, but it's really common in these files. Um, and the final thing to take as a lesson from this is that clients don't exist in a vacuum, and that you need to be looking for a network. Pulling on individual threads in this investigation um, was incredibly frustrating and didn't get us anywhere until we started putting them together. And when we started putting them together and looking at trails and networks, suddenly lots of things came into focus. The Danske Bank Estonia affair started off with people saying, oh, that's an odd transaction. I wonder what that payee's involvement is with that particular bank, that particular branch, that particular organization. And the more and more they built up and the more links that were made between them, the more obvious it became that we were looking at a global laundromat operation. And the longer we spend reporting individual transactions without seeing a bigger picture, the more the criminals are going to get away with it. Which, you know, we're AFC geeks. We don't want that to happen, do we? No, we don't. So I think I'll end there to give plenty of opportunity for questions to be raised. And Suzanne, I'll hand back to you at this point.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ray.
You're welcome.
I guess I'm still thinking about the 31 year, 31,000.
Yeah,
I still
yeah.
want to get it.
30, 30,
31,000 years.
31, 30. Well, it's 31 years to get to a billion. If you wanted to get to a trillion, it would take you 31,000 years to count that far. That far, yeah.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, but thank you so much for putting everything into perspective and giving us a great overview of these numbers and some of the interesting things behind this leak. Have got a couple of questions. I will wait for everyone as well, to
Sure.
come up with their questions on the chat. But some of the things that I have been seeing, like uh, I think it was the 2 months ago when the news came out, and there was a lot of conversation on LinkedIn, and it was a kind of a controversial
Mm,
conversation on LinkedIn between people when the leak came. And one of the things that it brought to my attention was that the news is kind of talking about the banks and how banks are getting the profit out of this, and it's basically highlighting on that. On the other hand, a lot of financial crime professionals, they were asking and they were saying that we have done the best job possible that we could
mm,
have done, and we are within those banks, specifically those five banks, that it was within the files, within the news, and they were saying that we're doing the best as we can, and this is kind of not kind of fair point of view. So
mm,
there have been like a lot of discussion around both sides. They were and I just want to know what were your point of view, being in between of this two. What were your im-
mm.
ideas
Oh,
and thoughts around it?
well, I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and there are moral conundrums here because one of the things that you can draw from what you see in the FinCEN Files leaks is that it's evidence that the SAR regime works. Here are banks fulfilling their obligations and making appropriate reports where they have suspicions. Now, yes, there are some contextual factors there, like the 166 days, for instance. The fact that they're doing the reporting in a jurisdiction that isn't actually the jurisdiction in which the offences are occurring. That's also an issue. But ultimately, banks are doing what they're told to do. meeting their responsibilities. So do we want to engage in an operation which is going to beat the banks up? Because the banks can't win, they can't answer back. It's an incredibly difficult situation from that point of view. So we thought long and hard before we got involved in this, because we knew that that was kind of going to be one of the outcomes that happened. But actually, if they don't have the right kind of context for some of this, if they don't have someone saying, well, actually the bank in that situation did act properly, they were powerless to do anything other than what they did, let me explain to you why that's the case. If there wasn't somewhere like that, I think you would have seen quite different reporting. You would have seen much angrier reporting, which wouldn't have shown the banks in a particularly good light. Not that the media are that motivated to show the banks in a good light, but actually having that kind of critical friend inside the process, we thought was probably fairly important. And we did stop a number of stories being published where we thought actually there isn't good enough public interest here to potentially spoil an important investigation. Don't print that. So
Right.
there was a certain amount of that, but ultimately I have to tell you, and my position on all of these leaks is very, very similar, which is leaks are ethically and morally difficult. But if you accept the fact that there has been a leak, you can't unleak it. So it kind of behoves you to make sure that what follows after the leak is responsible, and that you get the maximum value out of something that may have regrettably happened.
Yeah.
So
I totally,
there's no easy answer to that, but
yeah.
we don't ignore the ethical side of it.
I think everyone is looking at who should we blame? Should we blame the compliance officers? Should we blame the management of the banks? Should we blame the FIUs? Should we blame the person who leaked even the information? Because
No,
this is
Suzanne,
kind of a
no, no,
confidential. So
no, we should
it
blame the criminals. Every minute we spend blaming someone other than
exactly.
the criminals are winning.
Exactly. That
The-
was exactly what I was going through, like we have to look at, I think it's the bigger picture. And I think all of
yep.
these we have to, it's like a chain. We have to all collaborate with each other, to kind of figure out a best solution that we as
Mm.
compliance officers can help the FIUs. Not
Yeah,
having
exactly
those
right.
stars, completely, filed, it's not going to help them. Um,
Exactly right. And the one thing that we actually have to do is recognize who the bad guys are. We need to understand that the press aren't the bad guys. The press needs to understand that the banks aren't the bad guys. The bad guys are the bad guys. That should be fairly unambiguous. We're all on the side of the good guys, and we need to work together and collectively recognize that.
agree, agree. Great. I'm gonna go through some of the questions that
Right.
guys have been asking. One of the question for you, Ray, what kind of changes might the FinCEN file bring in banks and government and regulators? What do you
Okay.
see?
Well, even before the story broke, the FinCEN files caused change. Um, a month before the story broke, FinCEN put a story up on its front page warning that some disclosures were about to be made, and threatening all sorts of legal action, which was, never going to stop disclosure of the stories, unfortunately. Uh, but so they clearly knew about it well in advance, and I think the ICIJ would have sought their commentary in any case. Um, but 3 days before the disclosures were published, FinCEN announced publicly that it was undertaking a review to improve the US's money laundering framework, anti-money laundering framework, I should say. And I think that was not a coincidence. I think that was a direct response and some mitigating actions for what was about to happen. The very next day, on a Friday, which is not a day that the UK government tends to do stuff generally, the UK announced its response to the consultation on extending the powers of Companies House and companies registration agents, bearing in mind that UK corporate entities were such a feature of the FinCEN files. Again, that clearly looks like a response. You know, the consultation had finished a year earlier, nothing had happened, and suddenly, 48 hours before the disclosures, we've got a ready-made mitigant ready to go. So those changes are already happening. And I don't think that there is an MLRO around who hasn't reflected, following the FinCEN files disclosure, on their own SAR practices, and that can only be good.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Another question, I kind of know that, the answer, it might be, too long for you to give, but if you can give us like kind of the high level,
I'll
what
have
are
a
your
go.
thoughts? Uh, what would be the ideal procedure for an appropriate application and review of SAR report? What can we do to help? So, as professional, as financial crime professionals, what can we do, to help with that? I know that
Okay.
it's gonna be another hour or so of discussion, but can you
No, no,
share,
no, not at
what
all.
are
It's
your
really,
thoughts?
yeah, no, no. It's really quick. The thing is, there's loads of us. There's thousands of us, and there's a comparatively small number of people at the other end. So all of the onus is going to be on us to make our SARS more immediately understandable by the very, very small team that gets it at the other end. So the more we can do, the better. Which is why this is such a fabulous question. And if you talk to an FIU, certainly I've spoken to people at the NCA, one of the things that comes across loud and clear is get to the point. You know, we have not got time to read a 2, 3, 4 page SAR when we get to the end of it and say, well, what was that about then? What's going on? What's the bank alleging has happened? What is the actual suspicion? So basically, the first sentence of your SAR should be, we have suspicion that the following offence has been, is being, or will be committed. And then what is it? And everything else can follow that. Because if your FIU cannot get to that quickly, then it's a complete waste of their time, more often than not. So if you're in the UK and you're reporting to the NCA, you can find a fabulous brochure on their website, which is all aimed at improving the quality of your SARS. Now, of course, in an ideal world, if they actually had decent, intelligently designed forms, they wouldn't need to rely on us to do that, because you would have fields to fill in and it would be that easy. But what we're actually faced with when we do a SAR, when we fill in a SAR ourselves as an MLRO or a senior compliance officer or whoever we are, we're actually faced with effectively an on-screen version of a piece of parchment paper and a quill pen. Everything's longhand. We can communicate using codes if we want to, but we have to go and look them up and type them in. It's so 20th century. It's unreal.
That's great. That's absolutely. I could see, like on the chat box as well.
Yeah.
Everyone is adding to your point. They're saying we always start with it appears that and explain the points. So
Good.
that's a lot of great points. And I have seen, many of um, the regulators, they will put some sessions just to brief that. And I have been attending, some of the
Mm.
session, not in Canada specific, but in the Middle East. I know the regulator, just was, giving instruction, going line by line and telling us, this is what we need you,
Yeah,
to put this information so that it
absolutely.
can help us.
One thing that I would mention, since I'm among friends now, fellow geeks, the UK FIU has started a podcast of its own. It's currently in its third episode, and its third episode is all about how to improve the quality of your SARS. So if you were to do a search in your podcast provider of choice for UK FIU, you'll find that, and I would suggest it's a useful listen, even if your FIU isn't the NCA.
No, that's interesting. Thanks for letting
No
us know,
problem.
Ray. Another question that I'm sure that it would be in everyone's mind is that do you predict the new regulatory requirement will be added for the financial institution to use technologies like AI or RegTech solutions to make these SARs, easier to process by the FIUs? What are your
Um,
thoughts on that?
well, yeah, kind of. I mean, the regulators, in my experience, only have a qualified welcome for AI and regulatory technology on the basis that that their thinking tends to be, if we can't understand it, if it's not explicable, then we don't believe that it can be trusted and that firms can rely on it. Um, and increasingly, there's lots of evidence to show that technological solutions um, can actually kind of snowball in unhelpful directions if they're not very well managed. However, having said all of that, um, good cutting edge AI is capable of making a massive difference. Um, Firms, as in banks and other institutions, are investing an absolute fortune in getting AI right. The kind of fortunes that are available to commercial organisations, but typically not government agencies. So, as ever, um, the regulators, law enforcement, being publicly funded agencies, are kind of behind the curve on this. And that's where we actually need it. That's where we need the AI to work with the intelligence that's coming in from SARS, extract it quickly and efficiently, and be able to act on a timely basis to prevent crime. So that's where it needs to be. If it were me, I would be co-opting firms to pay some kind of levy or to lend staff to help with that effort. But who am I?
Yeah, right. Um, okay, that's great. Thanks for the answer. Another question is uh, now comparing this leak with other leaks in the past, like the Paradise paper, the Panama paper. What is the significance of this paper comparing to the others? What have you seen that it's more revealing
Um,
in this paper comparing to the others?
well, this is a leak from law enforcement, and that's a game changer. The previous leaks have been leaks from um, commercial private sector organisations. This is a leak from law enforcement, um, and and that's probably much more serious in terms of what it reveals, because what it reveals is not just commercially sensitive or secrets of privacy. This is potentially, there is potentially criminal jeopardy for someone even in reading this stuff. Um, so that's a big difference, and actually it's worth bearing that in mind in terms of the risks taken by the ICIJ and the journalists who were researching and publishing these stories. And in a number of countries in which the ICIJ have been publishing and have had journalists working, the journalists personally will have been under significant personal threat from some of the people whose interests were potentially threatened by these leaks. So that's also true, of course, with the Panama paper, Paradise papers, the commercial leaks. But this time you add legal jeopardy to that as well. Um, and being a journalist isn't perhaps a terribly safe job, certainly in some countries. That's what I take from it personally. I think the other thing that you can take from it is that, excuse me, law enforcement themselves kind of need to up their security game a little bit. Um, Now, I've said I won't speculate about the circumstances in which these papers were leaked, but I think it is publicly on record that files are distributed at FinCEN on USB drives. I mean, who does that anymore? Well, FinCEN, obviously, but I suspect they don't now.
Wow, wow, that's really interesting. I'm sure that now they increase their security a bit, so that another leak will not happen.
Oh, now they
Um,
have, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the USB drive is very interesting. Is there a way, to access and read the leaked SARS and documents anywhere? Um,
Read the SARS, no, other than the ones that have been reported on. But you can look at the macro data if you go to the ICIJ website, and they've got a whole bunch of downloadable stuff there. And some of the firms interested in data visualization have done some really amazing stuff with the raw data
yeah,
that the
yeah.
ICIJ has made available.
Yeah, that was a really interesting. I really enjoyed, seeing the whole
Mm,
globe and, seeing the transaction, going from one place to the other.
yeah.
It's really nice to see it visually, to really feel that, what exactly is happening rather than, like
Oh
looking
yeah.
at it in a document.
And it comes back to this network point, because these are not individual transactions. This is industrial, planned, networked activity that only makes sense when you can see the big consolidated picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ray. It
Oh, you're
was a
most
wonderful
welcome.
session, and I'm sure that everyone got a lot of insight and a lot of information about this paper, and it was really interesting. Thank you for giving us the behind the scene of this paper and an informative session.
You are
I'm
most welcome. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really, really delighted to be involved with this community. I think you're doing a great thing.
Thank you so much, Ray. I really appreciate it. And for everyone, if you haven't, heard Ray's podcast with Graham, definitely, do so.
Oh yeah.
It's very marvelous. I have listened to it, and it's a bit of laugh as well alongside of it, and yeah, so I think you're gonna all enjoy it. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Hope you find this interesting, this session interesting, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks.
And now
Thanks
go and have
everyone.
a weekend.
Yeah, good one. Good one. Yeah, prepare for the snow tomorrow, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you for attending. See you.
Goodbye.
Bye.